Beautiful, beautiful. The late Randy Weston with J.K. Blues. I just love that piece. It's from his 1993 album, Volcano Blues, with arrangements by Melba Liston and tenor sax by Teddy Edwards, sorry. This is Leid Stories. I'm Utrice Leid, and the special program that we begin today. The nation is preparing for a so-called trial tomorrow of the former president. And today, I figured we'll get a head start on a trial of a different sort, and that is an intellectual trial that was had in this country many, many years ago in the throes of its racist fervor. And I'm doing that as a special, as a result of the, of course, Black History Month. And couldn't find a better way to begin this special series that we will begin today. So we start today, and we will continue throughout not just the month, but for the rest of the year. For this week, however, we will continue on Tuesday, tomorrow, on Thursday, and Friday of this week. Our esteemed guest is historian and labor activist Dr. Jeffrey Perry, who has just published a more than 1,000-page work published by Columbia University Press on a man you probably have never heard about. His name is Hubert Henry Harrison, also called the father of Harlem Radicalism, indisputably a major, though overlooked, intellectual of his time. We are extremely fortunate, and I personally feel very, very honored to have as our tour guide today and for the rest of the week, Jeff Perry, who poured his life into this work, which is more than 1,500 pages in the form of 2 separate books, but these would comprise what I would call the starter kit for studying this wonderful and important scholar and contributing much to our understanding of Black America worldwide, as a matter of fact. It's not just in the United States. Harrison gives us an international view, of course, rooted in the United States, but it is not about just the United States and Africans in the United States. It's about the diaspora. Jeff, I thank you beyond measure for being with us and for being, self-assigned this task of pulling us through. We won't fight against you. We are willing students, I would tell you, of what you're about to teach us. So I thank you so much for being with us today, and I thank you in advance for your commitment to be with us for another few days, simply as a way of introducing Hubert Harrison to us in the course of this Black History Month. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Utrice, so very, very much, and I'm totally appreciative of the fact that you invited me to do this and your thoughtful words. like to start with some brief little introductory comments, and then a second round of a little more brief introductory comments, and then we could take it where you and the audience think they would like to go.
All right.
But first, I just want to mention I've just completed Volume 2, as you indicated, of the Hubert Harrison biography. It is entitled The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927. It's from Columbia University Press. It follows Volume 1, which is entitled Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1918 to 1927. They are both published by Columbia University Press, and if listeners care to purchase a copy, if they use the code CUP20, which stands for Columbia University Press 20, they can get a 20% discount through Columbia University Press's website. But they're not the only books. First, a little more on those two books. I believe these two books comprise the first full-length, multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean and only the fourth of an African-American after those of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes. So Harrison is really a giant of Black and Afro-Caribbean and diasporic and American history and radical history, as people will soon hear. So he merits such attention. He hadn't gotten in the past, and I've spent about 39 years working on this. And related to the work I did, his papers are now placed at Columbia University Press. It's a massive collection, which I inventoried and oftentimes transcribed. But very importantly, over 1,300 items are available for free on Columbia Rare Books and Manuscript Library digital collections under Hubert H. Harrison papers. And included in those free documents are Hubert Harrison's diary, which is a remarkable document. So we've got some of that material that people might be interested in. And I'll mention this now and I'll mention it later, maybe at the end. I have a tremendous amount of free information on Hubert Harrison on my webpage, jeffreybperry.net. Audios, videos, articles. Some of the videos that involve Harrison go up to 165,000 views. I mean, and so there's been growing attention since I started coming out with these books. Now, besides the 2-volume biography for Columbia, I also came out with a book entitled A Hubert Harrison Reader for Wesleyan University Press. And that's got about 153 of his articles, I believe. And I did a shorter volume, which was an update of Harrison's 1920 book entitled When Africa Awakes, and it's subtitled The Inside Story of the Stirrings and Strivings of the New Negro in the Western World. And that book was done with Diasporic Africa Press out of Brooklyn, New York. And I did a lot of supplementary notes, and I just went through it and I added to it and filled in things that the reader would, I'm sure, like to see. And I also included Harrison's original introductory, which wasn't available in many of the other versions that were available. So that's the first round of brief opening comments. But now I want to talk about who Harrison is, if that's okay, or was.
Just one thing before you start. I want people to know your name is spelled Jeffrey. Jeffrey.
Correct.
Jeffrey. Perry is Perry. Middle initial B is in boy.
Right.
Continue.
And parenthetically, just for a little humor in this, I use my middle initial because there's a Jeff Perry on Scandal. Sorry. Scandal. Come on. You want me to go on?
Let's begin. Let's dive into this, our charge for today.
Okay. St. Croix, Virgin Islands born, Harlem-based Hubert Harrison lived from 1883 to 1927. He was born in St. Croix, which at the time was Danish West Indies. His mother was a plantation worker from Barbados, and his father had been born enslaved in Barbados, in St. Croix, and also worked on a plantation. So he starts from the humblest of beginnings. He lives on the plantation, and then he moves, and he's in what's called the Water Gut section in Christiansted. It's a real poor section near the water. And he's in St. Croix for 17 years until he comes to New York in 1900 as a 17-year-old orphan. But there are many things about his Crucian roots that are very important, and I discussed these in Volume 1, and we can come back to this. But he took advantage of opportunities to read, whether it was going into the church library and reading books, having his sister, who had traveled to the U.S., send him books, studying under the island's best teacher, an Afro-Caribbean named Wilfred Jackson. And he grew up, and this report is kind of piggybacks on some things you said last week, but he kind of grew up in St. Croix, believe it or not, with the belief that he was the equal of anyone else, although he lived in total poverty and he was jet black, right? I mean, so this was kind of different from what you encounter in the U.S., particularly the southern U.S. But when he comes to New York in 1900, he follows the path laid by his sister, and that's typical of what often happened in Crucian families, and I believe other families from the Anglo-Caribbean. Sometimes the pioneer coming to the U.S. would be a female in the family and pave the way for others, and that's what happened in Harrison's case. And when he comes to New York, he lived with his sister in the West 60s, which was the area of largest concentration of African Americans in Manhattan at that time, because the IRT subway had not been completed. It wasn't completed until 1904, and then trains would go up into Harlem. And so he lived there. I think Thelonious Monk grew up on the next block about 20 years later. He's there, and he starts going to school. He only got an education up through 9th grade in St. Croix, and he starts going to school in New York, and very early there was indication of what was to come, because one of the daily newspapers, he's working 5 days a week and a couple nights, and he gets citywide honors in 2 areas. They had never seen anything like this, and one of the New York dailies says, genius found in West Indian pupil. Now, let me step back for a second. I'm sorry. But Harrison, who was he? Because we'll pick up on this story a little more. But he was a brilliant, autodidactic, working class, race and class conscious writer, orator, editor, educator, book reviewer, political activist, and radical internationalist. The historian Joel A. Rogers, in World's Great Men of Color, described him as an intellectual giant and freelance educator who was perhaps the foremost Afro-American intellect of his time and one of America's greatest minds. Rogers adds that no one worked more seriously and indefatigably to enlighten his fellow men, and none of the Afro-American leaders of his time had a saner and more effective program. The labor and civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph, referring to a period when Harlem was considered an international Negro Mecca and the center of radical black thought, described Harrison, as did others, as the father of Harlem Radicalism. Richard B. Moore, Barbados-born Richard B. Moore, a major activist and bibliophile who worked with the Socialist Party, the African Blood Brotherhood, the Communist Party. He worked with the Scottsboro Boys, and he worked with movements for Caribbean independence and federation, described him as, above all his contemporaries, in his steady emphasis that a vital aim was the liberation of the oppressed African and other colonial peoples. Harrison played unique signal roles in the largest class radical movement, socialism, and the largest race radical movement, the New Negro/Garvey movement of his era. He was the leading Black organizer, agitator, and theoretician of the Socialist Party of New York, the founder of the militant New Negro movement and its first organization, the Liberty League, and first newspaper, The Voice, the editor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World, and the principal radical influence on the Garvey movement. He was a self-described radical internationalist and extremely knowledgeable, yet non-arrogant writer and orator on Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and Latin America, Europe, and the Muslim world. He was a union organizer with both the hotel workers and the Pullman porters, and a postal unionist. He was a postal worker for 4 years until he gets fired through the efforts of Booker T. Washington, which we might want to talk about. And he was a prominent IWW supporter and speaker at the 1913 Patterson Silk Strike. Harrison was also a pioneer Black activist in both the free thought and birth control movements. And very importantly, he is the key ideological link in the two great trends of 20th century Black struggle. That is the class radicals, if you will, and the race radicals, because he's a major influence on A. Philip Randolph, who marches with MLK in the March on Washington in the 60s, and he's the major influence on Marcus Garvey, and then when we extend it down to later period, Malcolm's family. Malcolm's father was a Garveyite preacher, and his mother was a reporter for the Negro World, the same newspaper that Harrison had been editor of. So a few other things, just opening comments. I mentioned he was described as a genius in New York while still in high school in one of the New York dailies. He reportedly spoke or read as many as 6 languages to varying degrees, but he was brilliant. He was an autodidact, but he was brilliant. And amongst his other messages for current and future generations were read, 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 and free public libraries are one of the great institutions in this country. So he read all the time, and he also spoke. He reportedly read or spoke the 6 languages, including in his last year, he was teaching himself Arabic and reading the Quran, not because he was religious, but because it was a religion of so many people of African descent. He was a prolific and influential journalist. As I indicated, in my searches over all these years, and my searches have gone to several continents and throughout the Caribbean and places in the Americas, and we've located about 700 of his writings, and he would edit besides his own papers, and his papers were The Voice from 1917 to 1919, a publication called The New Negro in 1919, which was a journal of the International Consciousness of the Darker Races. Please note the dates on these, because this is the Voice publication of the New Negro movement was 1917. The New Negro Monthly was 1919. This is 6 years and 8 years before Alain Locke's publication, The New Negro. And in 1920, he edits Garvey's Negro World. He's the principal managing editor, and he puts out his second book, which is entitled, again, When Africa Wakes, the Inside Story of the Stirrings and Strivings of the New Negro in the Western World, and has over 50 articles on the New Negro movement prior to, up to 1920 and prior to 1920. And his last major publication that he was in charge of was entitled, it was for the International Colored Unity League, and it was called The Voice of the Negro. Harrison was also a highly praised book critic. He received tremendous praise, particularly from people like Eugene O'Neill, who later wins the Pulitzer Prize. But O'Neill thinks that Harrison's review of The Emperor Jones is one of the finest he's ever read, and he says any theater I have anything to do with, you have a role in. And Henry Miller, another noted author in the early period, used to go and watch Harrison speak on the street corners because he was an unrivaled soapbox orator. As a soapbox orator, Harrison, particularly when he spoke for the last 20 years of his life, indoors and out. And when he was with the socialists, he spoke for as many as 23 times a week during Eugene Debs' 1912 political campaign. He spoke before 50,000 people at Union Square. One of my favorite stories is one that I drew from the New York Times, how in 1912, Hubert Harrison goes out down to the corner of Broad and Wall Streets in Lower Manhattan and gets up on his podium at 1 o'clock and speaks to an audience that reached as far as his voice could reach for 3 hours until the bell tolled, the Wall Street bell tolled in what I refer to, and he was speaking on socialism, and I refer to that as an early Occupy Wall Street. Indoors, he was a pioneer lecturer. I believe he was the first regular lecturer for the New York City Board of Education for about 4 years in the 1920s. He lectured on wide-ranging topics: politics, literature, poetry, African history, ancient African history, and so on. Just immense intellectual breadth. He wrote a regular series in 1924 for about 6 months for the Boston Chronicle, which is a wonderful series of short essays, which are included in my book, a Hubert Harrison Reader, but they are described and detailed somewhat in the volume 2 of my Harrison biography. Oh, one other thing, I want to step back for a second. In my biography of Hubert Harrison, volume 2, it's a very big book, as you indicated, but I spend great time with the footnotes, with the end notes. And in those end notes, wherever possible, I try to provide a link for audiences today to go look at what is being talked about. So if I'm talking about a Harrison article that is either online and available, or it's in his papers, and I give a link to his papers and where you can find that article, or if he's doing a book review in 1922 of a book, I link both to the Harrison's review, but also to the original book, which may be available at Internet Archive or Hattie Trust, one of these places that are committed to putting materials up online permanently. So it's a tremendous resource. And as I believe you indicated earlier, these 2 volumes, Sotries, were written, because Harrison's that important, but they're also written for current and future generations to build off, draw from, etc. A few more things about Harrison. He was an important supporter of Black writers and artists, including Charles Gilpin, the actor, the leading Black actor in the early 20s, the musician Eubie Blake, the sculptor Augusta Savage, the poet Claude McKay, and the writer J.A. Rogers, and others, writer Sol Platt from South Africa. He was a leading community-based public intellectual, and he pioneered kind of the tradition of soapbox oratory in Harlem, which was subsequently carried on by people like A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owen, Marcus Garvey, Richard B. Moore, and much later Malcolm X. He was also a bibliophile who, along with Arthur Schomburg, helped transform the 135th Street Public Library into what is now the International Center for Research in Black Culture, known as the Schomburg Center. And Harrison was on the founding committee that grew into what became the Schomburg Center. He donated a lot of books, but not nearly as many as Schomburg. But he also would speak regularly at the library to bring people into the library to get familiarize themselves with it. Ernestine Rose, the librarian at that library, said she never had a person who borrowed as many books to read themselves as Hubert Harrison. He was just an omnivorous reader. And as I said earlier, he believed that free public libraries were one of the great institutions in the U.S. Some final, we got a few more comments here. His biography, I think, is important because it's a life worth telling and knowing, and I think it's a remarkable testimony to human potential. He starts with the meagerest of beginnings, impoverished, and he's up against a lot of tremendous obstacles, and he comes and he essentially lives in poverty all his years in the U.S., and he accomplishes so much. His biographies, the 2 volumes, offer profound insights on race, class, religion, immigration, war, democracy, and social change in America. Very importantly, I think we'll discuss this at some point, we see how the color line was drawn differently in St. Croix than in the U.S., where Harrison came, where he migrated to. And we see also his reasons and his thinking behind his turn to free thought and his break from organized Christianity and his criticisms of the Christian church, particularly in Africa, and the role it played in Africa. And this is a thing that distanced himself at first from many people because, as we know, the Black church is the most powerful institution in the Black community. Other insightful comments that Harrison makes is he understood the twofold aspect of democracy in America. And that is, we see how when democracy is a white privilege, like a gerrymandered political district or such things, it is a retardant to social change. Or when the cant of democracy is used, as Woodrow Wilson did, to urge to enter imperialist war, Harrison saw right through that, and he said, well, Wilson had no intention of bringing democracy to the world. As a matter of fact, when Wilson first stated his intent to go into the war to make the world safe for democracy, that's when Harrison founded his Liberty League and Voice, and the slogan they used at that time was "Make the South Safe for Democracy." So he challenges much thinking on in those areas. He also, and this notion of Harrison emphasizing the struggle against white supremacy as a retardant to social change is central to his work throughout his life, and I think merits much more discussion. Harrison also, I think, is going to cause some rethinking of the Black studies paradigm, because besides being a critic of William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and labor leaders, Samuel Gompers, and socialists and communists, he also offers criticisms which are very much on mark of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. That's kind of the big three of early 20th century Afro-America. And people will be interested in those. And I want to add, as I'm telling this story, and I say this right from the beginning, when I write the biography of Harrison, I draw from some insights from a few people. One, very importantly, is an insight from J.A. Rogers, who writes, and I'm shortening this, "No man is perfect to his valet." And he goes, and that was certainly the case with Hubert Harrison. Harrison had his faults, but he goes, that is not to detract from his essential greatness. So it's not like this is these books were written to just glorify Harrison and just go after all these other people. I let Harrison speak for himself because I think it's important for our generations today to learn to understand Harrison's thinking and why he said what he did and what the impact was. Now, related to that, one of the things that is very important is how Harrison, after he came to the U.S., nurtured himself intellectually. And one of the first things he did before kind of around the time of his break from religion, was he got involved in Black working class intellectual circles. He was living in the West 60s, and there were two churches. St. Benedict the Moor Roman Catholic Church was a principal one on West 53rd Street in Manhattan. Again, this is before the IRT goes up to Harlem. And they would hold lyceums. And Arturo Alfonso Schomburg from Puerto Rico would go there, Johnny Bruce, Williana Jones, who would later be Williana Jones Burroughs, Charles Burroughs. These are working class Black intellectuals, and there are many others. And they would go there and they would have discussions and debates, and they would be freewheeling, and people would voice their opinions, and then they would discuss them. But they could leave and still, be friends afterwards and go out and have a bite to eat or whatever. And this is an intellectual atmosphere that Harrison was nurtured in. He referred to the lyceums as the germ of Black racial consciousness. It was also a great place where Afro-Americans and Afro-Caribbeans came together, because in the early decades there was still there was some tension for the period, but there was tension between the two. But people would come together, and this is the environment he was nurtured in, and he carried that with him for the remainder of his life. So we can talk more specifically about Harrison's criticisms of Booker T, Du Bois, and Garvey, but a couple more things. Harrison understood, I mentioned, the twofold nature of democracy in America, but he said a few other things in his period with the socialists that I think are very important for activists today. He said that politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. Now, when I first read that, I had to look up the word touchstone. I wasn't quite sure I knew exactly what he meant. And a touchstone, for those who might not be familiar with the word, is a black stone. And you use it, you rub a metal against it to see if it's really the gold that it's purported to be. And it's a tremendous metaphor that Harrison chose, because if we looked at our society and you pick any issue, unemployment, housing, education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, let's put it to the test. How are Black people faring, and what are we going to do about it? So a very insightful position. And he goes on to say that besides politically, the Negro is a touchstone of the modern democratic idea, he also says that true democracy and equality implies a revolution startling to even think of. And that would be a theme throughout his life. If we could really strive towards and achieve, successful struggles for equality, justice, and opportunity, he felt very confident that Afro-Americans, African Americans could take it from there. They could handle things themselves, right? So he thought they were very worthy goals to struggle for. Also, in the two-volume biography, there's a number of important people who went to the story. And one thing I did in both volumes, and I hope people appreciate this, they're long volumes, but when he's doing work in the community, I make it a point to list the names of people who are active participants in the meetings he attends or the committees he's involved with. And I already am getting very positive response from the Virgin Islands, where people, when I talk about the meetings of Virgin Islands up here in New York, Virgin Islanders, they're so eager and appreciative to hear of names of family members or people they know, being active up here. And I do that throughout the book in terms of many little-known Harlem activists and community activists. And amongst those people, that I mentioned are, some in St. Croix I'm not going to go into right here, but besides Schomburg Bruce, George Young, who was the leading black bibliophile in the early period, Frances Reynolds Kaiser, who's an extraordinary woman, the first black woman graduate of Hunter College, who runs a place called the White Rose Home for colored working girls, I believe was the subtitle, on West 86th Street. It was a place where black women from down south and from the Caribbean could come and have a safe place to live, and they could have their children stay while they went off to work. And Harrison taught classes there and classes for the children. And Kaiser went on to be a founding member of the NAACP, and then she became a principal aide to Mary McLeod Bethune. So she's a remarkable woman who most people have also never heard of. And she's also important in Harrison's story for a number of reasons, particularly because when he makes his break from religion, it's an ideological break at first, and it's very torturous because church teachings are a worldview, and he was breaking from all of that, and he writes a lengthy letter to Miss Kaiser, which is in his diary, which is just very powerful, and explains his thinking. And at the conclusion, he says, well, based on all this, I think I'm an agnostic, And so she's a woman that appears in the story. Then we have Booker T, Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter. Harrison and Trotter organized the leading black protest effort, national black protest effort during World War I. It's called the Liberty Congress. Eugene Debs enters very much because Harrison's campaigning vigorously. Harrison's out at the what's called the American Labor Museum now, but he's out at the Patterson Silk Strike speaking with Gurley Flynn and Big Bill Haywood and major labor leaders. As I said earlier, Henry Miller, a very wonderful writer, praises Harrison. He said he'd go to watch Harrison speak all the time down around Union Square. Mary White Ovington, Jolie Stingarn, Randolph Owen, Cyril Briggs, who's a very prominent black activist, comes from Nevis St. Kitts originally, and he's the founder of the African Blood Brotherhood and has a publication called The Crusader, and gets very involved with the Communist Party. Hodge Kiernan, who comes from Montserrat. Hermie Weiswood, who I believe her husband, anyway, I'm not sure, is from Suriname, Dutch Guiana. Lovett Fort Whiteman, and figures such as Charles Gilpin. Adam Clayton Powell Sr., who is at the founding meeting of Harrison's Liberty League. Andy Razaf, who's the leading poet of the early New Negro movement. Eslanda Cardoza Good, she's the mother of Paul Robeson, but she would be passing out Harrison's newspaper, The Voice. And James C. Kanagata from St. Croix, who's the father of the actor Canada Lee. These are just some of the names that come up. Other insights from Harrison are he emphasized that race prejudice was socio-historically determined, that the cause of African Americans should be championed, and pointed the way forward to significant social change, that it was the duty of progressive, quote, whites, I put that phrase in quotes, to oppose race prejudice, and that special appeals were needed to reach the oppressed African American black masses. He also very significantly challenged the two main props of white supremacy among white workers. The argument that that undermines struggle against white supremacy. The idea that racism is innate, Harrison challenged that, and the idea that white workers, quote, benefit from race prejudice. He also made clear, and this was an insight he had that I wish people were aware of, I wish we all were aware of for the past 100 years, but he left the Socialist Party around 1914, and he offered what I think was one of the most profound but least heeded criticisms in the history of the left. And he said basically that the leaders of the Socialist Party, like the leaders of the labor movement, put the white race first before class. And it would have been great if people had heard that and thought about it and drew from it and sought to address it. He also understood the World War I, would result in a larger measure of democracy for the peoples engaged, and that while the war was reportedly being fought to make the world safe for democracy, he stressed it was important to demand an end to lynching, segregation, and disfranchisement, and enforcement of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments back home, but also to support struggles in Africa, Asia, Latin America. He challenged during the war the NAACP, which did not challenge Wilson's position, as Du Bois did not challenge Wilson's position. And he was also militant. He developed a political voice. He argued for a militant political voice. He stressed armed self-defense when it was necessary. Interestingly, Harrison's Liberty League developed a tricolor flag. The colors were black, brown, and yellow. And he said that's because that's the colors we are domestically and internationally. From that tricolor, Marcus Garvey had joined Hubert Harrison's organization in 1917. Garvey doesn't join anyone's organization, for those familiar with Garvey. But from Harrison's tricolor, Garvey later developed his own tricolor, the red, black, and green, which is what people are familiar with. But Harrison offered his own comments on the change because Harrison thought the black, brown, and yellow was a very profound and good way to go. Then, so that's an opening. We can talk about why he's not better known and any specifics of any of these areas. But I want to take a breath, catch a breath, and see where you think we should go, Latrice.
You think you deserve a breath? Really?
No, I'm going to have a sip. I'm going to have a sip of coffee.
And that's just your overview. We're not into this work that you have compiled here yet, and that's just an overview. Let me ask about a personal side of Hubert Harrison.
Yes.
There's turmoil all going on all around him. Yet he persists, even to the point of endangering himself, because at that time, as we know, we had many clashes, we had a lot of violence, and based primarily on thought. But he just took it to another level, because it wasn't just thought. It was thoughts of a black man. And this level of thought coming from a black man must have jarred society as a whole. So how did he transact that? How did he come through that? And without fear, without backtracking, without apologizing, what was the risk to him personally in advancing his ideas?
Well, the risk to him was at times very great. When he was speaking on street corners, he sometimes had to defend himself. He was attacked, his record of him being attacked by a mob of whites, and he picked up the table leg and defended himself. And of course, he was the one who got arrested. East St. Louis, when East St. Louis erupted in, white supremacist riots in 1917, I think it was, and Harrison called for armed self-defense. And it's interesting that the East St. Louis, where Harrison called for armed self-defense, was, I think it's 12 miles from Ferguson, where there had been a lot of protests later on, but Harrison had a mass meeting in Harlem to support the East St. Louis African-American community with his bold pronouncements. He was monitored by the military intelligence and the Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau of Investigation was the precursor to the FBI. I think FBI is officially named in 1935. When the Ku Klux Klan came out, they started, mobilizing very actively in the North in the 20s. And I lived in North Jersey, and out this way, they burned a cross on Garrett Mountain, which overlooks Patterson, right? And they were starting to really try and mobilize. And Harrison goes out to Patterson, New Jersey, and holds a series of talks in which he openly challenges the Klan to debate. I mean, he's willing to take on all of this. But he also at times, used certain cautions. For instance, people from the St. Croix, it was a Danish possession, and when Harrison comes to the U.S., when he had to face the draft and other, possible problems with the legal authorities, and his status was not clear. One of a fellow named Boyer, who's one of the historians of the Virgin Islands, points out that for these early Crucians, they were citizens in but not of the U.S. And Harrison and no one else knew what that meant. Didn't know what that meant because he didn't have U.S. citizenship. He only got it in 1922, and so even though he had been here since 1900 and he had put in application for it, but so they were citizens of Denmark. Particularly the African-descended Crucians, the more purely European-descended Crucians apparently didn't have such a problem because it was assumed that they were citizens of Denmark and they could renounce that citizenship. But it was not the same for Harrison. So because of his certain vulnerability and also the fact of facing a draft in a war which he didn't believe in, and having at that time 4 children, because he would ultimately have 5 children, when he filled out his World War I papers, he checked he was unsure of his citizenship status, and but he also explained that in that period, in some of his speaking, he tried to use Woodrow Wilson's words to camouflage, in a certain sense, what he was saying, and he pretended that he believed what Woodrow Wilson was saying about let's make the world safe for democracy, but Harrison used it on his terms, in terms of African peoples and peoples of the world. He tried to turn Wilson's words back on Wilson, and Wilson said he wanted people to have a political voice in democracy, and Harrison's paper was the voice, and he ran a slogan quoting from Wilson about a political voice. So at times he tried to be a little cautious, but he was, for the most part, very bold, faced physical harm, and was kind of undaunted.
Okay, give us an idea. We have only a few more minutes in this opening segment. Where are you going to be taking us?
Well, I'd like to go wherever you want, but we could discuss in more detail the specifics as we go. We could go through the 2 volumes and look more specifically at what some of his thinking was on, certain periods of his life, particularly on the socialist period or on free thought, if you want. But we might want to get into his criticisms of Booker T. and Du Bois, because they're very interesting and people probably should know about them, and Garvey. I want to say that Harrison is the pioneer of the New Negro movement, militant New Negro movement, and this is 7-8 years before Alain Locke. But if you read in the college text and everything, the canonical text book called The New Negro, at first it didn't even mention Harrison, a lot of these works, and he's largely ignored. So I think it would be good maybe next time to talk about some of the reasons why Harrison has been ignored so long, because that's very fascinating, and it says much about, how discrimination works in this society, but it also gets into things about how he paid, for his views, and also how history gets written in this country. And by that, I think it's worthwhile getting into how Harrison is a giant of a figure, but he's been largely ignored. And so if someone's an academic professor, some such, and they've never written or said very much, if anything at all, on Hubert Harrison, I find that it seems that they find it hard to say very much about him now, because if they do, they've got some explaining to do. Another thing where we might want to take it is to look at the question of funding, of how people receive their money. How did Booker T. Washington get his money? How did Du Bois get his money? How did Owen and Randolph get their money? How did Garvey get his money? And because Harrison turned down when he was offered money, he was offered $10,000 in 1917, and he refused to, because he said, no, I want to control the voice. I don't want to be somebody else. And the Communist Party offered him money, and he turned down that money. They wanted him to be their champion of their Negro section. And it was said he didn't want to be the CP's stalking horse against Garvey. So, I mean, a lot of in-depth things we could go into. But again, I just want to stress before we get off, I encourage people a few things. One, these 2 volumes, Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918, and The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 27. You can get them for a discount. CUP 20 is the code at Columbia University Press. One thing that listeners could do, which is very important, besides, if they can get the book themselves, but please talk to your public or your college or your university library and ask them to make sure that they get these volumes so you and others can have access to the life story of Hubert Harrison. That's very important. Again, the webpage, www.jeffreybperry.net, has a tremendous amount of information. There are many other things we might want to go into. We might want to go into Harrison's work as a book reviewer. He's a pioneer, first regular black book reviewer. He has some profound thoughts on book reviewing. He speaks 3 times on the radio way back in the 20s. He's a real pioneer in that respect too.
But you'll have to hold it. You'll have to hold it until the next time, which is tomorrow.
Okay.
Because we're out of time. And this was just the opening salvo to give an overview of where we will be headed in our discussions with Jeffrey B. Perry, the author of Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918, and Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927. Thanks, Jeffrey, for being with us today and getting things started, but more tomorrow. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Sotries.
Thank you. All right, that does us for today. We'll see each other again tomorrow. Please call your friends and let them know that this very special series is on, featuring Hubert Harrison for Black History Month. Bye-bye.